So my wife and I finally jumped on the sourdough train this year and we are loving it. It fascinates me that sourdough bread is really only 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt. We are having a ton of fun experimenting with sourdough in all sorts of ways. In this video, I'm going to guide you through the process to making sourdough bread. There are so many different guides and recipes out there, but the recipe in this video is pretty easy and straightforward compared to many others. This recipe is the one that we learned to make our first successful loaves with, so if you're a beginner or looking for a new recipe to get a successful sourdough loaf, look no further. Now sit back, relax, and let's learn how to make sourdough bread. First things first, let's address some sourdough elephants in the room. This is the first. This here is a starter. This is where the magic of sourdough bread making happens. Now in this video I won't cover in detail how to make a starter, but I will give you the quick idea and background. A sourdough starter is basically a culture of yeast and bacteria that leaven and flavor bread. This is the stuff that helps make the bread rise and get all poofy, as well as give the bread a distinctive sour flavor. Mainly it is just flour and water, but one that has been nurtured and cared for over many weeks. To make it, you need to combine flour and water, and every day for about 2 weeks you discard half the starter and add more flour and water to replace it. During this process, the mix naturally cultures as the good bacteria eat away the bad bacteria, and eventually only good bacteria are left, and those are what help make it leaven. This is a very quick and simple way to cover this. I'll leave a couple links to good videos on how to make sourdough starter. One day I'll share one on this channel and link it below. You can make it yourself, get some from a friend. I have a friend that got some of his from a local baker. However you do it, you'll need sourdough starter before you can make any sourdough bread. Now the second sourdough elephant in the room I should address before we go any further is this. Sourdough takes a lot of time. This is not a fast process. It's not like using active dry or quick rise yeast where you can make a fresh loaf of bread in a couple hours. Most sourdough recipes take almost 24 hours from complete start to finish. The good news is that this work is very minimal and easy. There's just a good amount of waiting to be done in between the steps. So keep that in mind when planning to make sourdough. I just didn't want to surprise you when you start hearing the waiting times. And now that the sourdough elephants are covered, let's start this recipe. The first step to making sourdough bread is to feed the sourdough starter. This is to help activate the starter so it is ready to leaven and make dough and bread rise well. You'll want to feed the starter 4 to 12 hours before you plan on using it. It needs about this long to get active. You'll know the starter is active and ready for use once it has doubled and is bubbly. My wife likes to use a hair tie to help track where the level started and where it ended. We normally feed our starter around 1:30 p.m. so that we can start the process of mixing ingredients at around 7:30 p.m. or after our kids are in bed. I'll leave a schedule on the side of the screen throughout the video from now on so you can follow along. You'll want to feed the sourdough starter with however much active starter you need for the recipe. For this recipe, to make one loaf you'll either need 50 grams or 100 grams depending on if you'll be using bread flour or all-purpose flour. I'll leave a breakdown for each of those recipes on the screen. To the starter, you'll add half flour and half water for what you need. So either 25 grams of flour and 25 grams of water if you need 50 grams of active starter, or 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water if you need 100 grams of starter. Once you have an active starter, it is time to mix. Again, I have each of the recipes on the screen depending on what flour you use. Both versions have worked well for us. The bread flour usually gets a bit more rise, bubbles, and a crisp crust. The all-purpose flour usually has a tighter crumb and softer texture. Add the starter and room temperature water to a bowl and mix. We like to use a Dutch whisk like this for mixing. It really helps. If you don't have one, you can try using a wooden spoon or your hands. The dough just gets really sticky. Wet your hands a bit before handling the dough. This helps with the stickiness. Then add the salt and mix. Finally, add the flour and mix. When it is completely mixed, it'll look real shaggy. That's good, and that's what you want at this stage. Try to get all of the dry bits mixed in, and it's ready to go. Once the dough is all mixed, let this rest on the counter for 1 hour. After it is rested, it is time for the stretch and folds. This process helps strengthen the dough so it can be ready for shaping and good rising. To perform a stretch and fold, lightly wet your hands and scoop under the dough and gently pull it up. Stretch this up without tearing and let the dough fall back onto itself. Turn the bowl 90 degrees and stretch and fold again. Do this a total of 4 times, and the first set of stretch and folds is done. Cover the bowl and let this rest for 15 minutes, after which you'll perform a second set of stretch and folds. Again, there are so many different recipes and guides for how long to wait and how many folds to do and more. For this recipe, we like to get everything done in the evening. It's just easier to get it all done like this after our kids have gone to bed. In total, you'll do 4 sets of stretch and folds. Time between first and second, 15 minutes. Time between the second and third, 20 minutes. Time between the third and the fourth, about 30 minutes, each time doing 4 stretches, turning the bowl 90 degrees for each individual stretch. I'll have that time schedule up on the screen again to show the progress. You'll notice as you are proceeding with the stretch and folds that the dough is becoming far less shaggy and loose and is becoming stronger and smooth. This is good. This means the strength is developing well. After the last set of stretch and folding, cover the bowl and let it sit on the counter, or someplace warmer like the microwave or oven, for 7 to 10 hours until the dough has doubled. This is the fermenting stage, and the main stage that will give the dough its sour flavor. This amount of time has worked pretty well for us because we let the dough sit overnight during this step, which makes it ready for final work and shaping in the morning. After the dough has had its long rest and doubled in size, it is ready for shaping. First, let the dough fall out of the bowl onto the counter. You can do some gentle scraping if it's stuck, but it should just slowly fall right out of the bowl. Let this sit uncovered for about 30 minutes so it can get used to its new shape. Dust the dough and counter lightly with flour and flip the dough so that the flour side is on the counter, and it's time for final shaping. This step is what helps keep the dough held together into what shape you intend the final loaf to be. Gently pull out and stretch the dough a bit into a rectangle shape. Next, fold the dough up about a third of the way. Stretch out the sides of the dough a bit and pull it into the center. Next, take the corners and fold them in. Roll the whole dough onto itself and gently pull it against the counter to help seal everything up. Flip the shaped loaf into a covered banneton that has been lightly floured with what was the bottom of the loaf facing upward, seam side up. You can also do something that's called stitching, which is basically pulling the dough onto itself to keep everything sealed up by pressing it together. If you don't have a banneton, a bowl with a tea towel that has been lightly floured works really well. There are lots of great videos detailing the intricacies of shaping sourdough loaves. I'm still getting the hang of it myself. I'll leave a link to a video that really helped us learn how to shape. When the loaf is all shaped and ready, this needs to rest one final time on the counter for around 1 to 2 hours. After it has had that final rest, it is either ready to bake immediately, or you can put it in the fridge and bake later. Usually we stick with about 1 hour on the counter, and then we stick it into the fridge to bake later in the evening, because you know, work, kids, and bedtimes. Putting it in the fridge for at least 30 minutes regardless does help with the next cutting and scoring step, but it's not required. Whenever you are ready to bake the bread, get a Dutch oven, put into the oven, and preheat it to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. For this recipe, the Dutch oven does need to be hot and preheated before the baking starts. We usually just leave it in the oven while the oven preheats. That gets it plenty hot. Also, we like to put a baking sheet below the Dutch oven. This helps keep the bottom crust of the bread from getting too overbaked or potentially burnt. Once the oven and Dutch oven are preheated, grab a piece of parchment or dough sling and place the dough seam side down onto it. Now it's time for scoring the dough. This helps control how the steam escapes during baking, which is both aesthetically pleasing and makes the dough rise uniformly. There are lots of different ways to score bread, and you can even get creative with fun designs. At its most basic, you'll just need to do one big score around 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep along the whole length of the dough at around a 30-degree angle. To do decorative scores, just give light slashes in the pattern you want. If you go too deep, the cuts will open up a bit and spread too much and won't keep the original look of the design you were probably going for. I've tried several different designs, and they are quite fun to play with. My main go-to is a wheat-like pattern with diagonal cuts facing each other and then one big score to the side. Have fun with this part. There are lots of inspiration picks out there. With the scored loaf, very carefully place it into the preheated Dutch oven. Be careful, very careful. The Dutch oven is hot. Use oven mitts or gloves. Carefully place the dough in and put the hot lid back on and bake this at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes. After the 20 minutes, remove the lid and bake another 20 to 25 minutes. If you want a lighter and softer crust, take it out early. If you want something nice and golden brown or darkened to get a real crisp crust, leave it in all the way to 25 minutes or maybe even a couple minutes longer, depending how dark you like it. When it's all done, remove the bread from the Dutch oven and let it cool for at least 1 hour before enjoying. I know, even more waiting, but it really does make a difference. Firstly, the dough is far too hot to enjoy right away. Secondly, if you cut it open too soon, it can actually negatively affect its texture. It can make the bread a bit gummy, less soft, and really it's worth to wait at least an hour before slicing it open. You spent this much time working on it. What's another hour? And finally, we've made it. That's how to make a loaf of sourdough bread. To slice, I usually go perpendicular to the score cut and cut in the middle. I like cutting slices from that by taking a half and laying the center down and cutting from there. Makes it way easier for me. This sourdough bread is so good. It's soft, fluffy, crisp on the outside, just enough sour flavor but not overwhelming, and I find it very satisfying to make a fresh loaf of bread and know that all that went into it was flour, water, and salt. Also, this bread makes about the best grilled cheeses I've ever had, and its leftovers make perfect French toast, the best I've ever had also. This sourdough will last about 1 week on the counter. It's most fresh in the first few days, of course, but it lasts surprisingly well, unlike other breads that typically you need to eat them within the first day or two or they start tasting stale. By the way, if you were interested in any of the tools I used in this video, I'll leave links to everything in the video description. And now you know how to make sourdough bread. I hope this recipe helps you get into the wonderful world of sourdough. I've got other sourdough recipes I'm looking forward to sharing on this channel, so make sure to subscribe if you're interested. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please consider leaving a like to this video. Also, again, subscribe if you like sourdough. I'm planning to share more sourdough recipes on this channel, so stay tuned. Thanks again. See you next time.